Greetings and welcome to this 3D Motive video course on building Unity-ready modular environments in Blender. I'm Alan Thorne, and in this part of the course we'll unwrap and texture paint our modular environment. We'll start by using the Blender UV editor and related tools to unwrap our model UVs and bake ambient occlusion maps to simulate indirect illumination. Then we'll jump into GIMP to build and paint an atlas texture that will map onto our environment and work well with the Unity engine as well as other real-time renderers. By the end of this part, you'll have a solid understanding of a Blender to GIMP texture creation workflow, one that you'll be able to apply to your own game projects to create expansive and immersive environments. So without further ado, let's jump in and build textures for modular environments. So here I am in Blender, and before we get started on our texture creation work, I want to talk about an issue, a very general issue that pertains to Blender. And this is not specific to texture creation, it applies more widely to when you're working with Blender on any kind of project. One of the most famous issues that arises is that you may begin with a scene like this, or you may be using absolutely any scene at all. You may, for example, select this cube and pull out the faces a little bit, perhaps change it, and you may make changes to your scene. And then when you finish making your changes, perhaps you accidentally close the application. Maybe you choose File, Quit, or you press the Close button at the top of the window, and when you do this, Blender disappears completely. It just returns you to the desktop. It didn't ask you if you wanted to save your file or anything like that at all. So what happened to all of that data? Did we lose it? Well, let's find out. I'm going to double click on the Blender icon to load Blender, and here is the interface. Again, it doesn't size itself to the recording window, so I'm just going to size up this recording window here just to put it back to normal, and you'll see that we begin with this blank empty scene, and it doesn't appear to have restored our changes at all. It seems that we've lost all of our data and Blender did nothing to prevent that from happening. Well, in fact, you can actually get back all of those changes that you never saved. All you have to do to achieve that is choose File and Recover Last Session from the menu. You will see that what this actually does is open up a file called quit.blend, and Blender will always save to that file every time you close the application. So by choosing Recover Last Session, I suddenly get back all the changes that I had there and the ones that I didn't save. So that's how you can go about restoring any data that you feel you may have lost. It turns out that Blender does keep your data, it's not necessarily lost at all. So now I want to discuss the issue of UV unwrapping and texture creation for our modular environment set. What I have open in front of me here is the Blender file that we completed in the previous part of this course. There we modeled all the different pieces for our environment set, and we have those scattered across different layers in the file. So right now I have the first layer active with this tile piece here, the base tile for our environment set. But we have other pieces on other layers. For example, if I select this layer, we can see that we've got the main floor piece that we're going to be using to tile across the floor. We have this piece here, which is a quad section for the wall. In the next part, the next layer here, we have, for example, this quad section is just being mirrored and repeated to the other side. Then we have some other quad sections with more detail, and we also have corner pieces, which we have one here. This is an inward turn, and then we have another corner piece which is an outward turn, and we also have a prop crate. Now you could go ahead and create other pieces for the modular environment, and I encourage you to do so, but I'm going to be specifically looking at these pieces here in this video. Now what I want to do is we want to start really applying a texture to this environment, and the first step in this process is to unwrap the UVs for our model. Now what does UV unwrapping involve? Well, let's just focus on this piece here for a second. We have a wall piece, and it is a 3D model with width, height and depth. It exists in 3 dimensions, but of course textures are 2-dimensional. So what we need to do is to effectively work out how we can insert imaginary cuts into this model so that we could unfold it as though it were a sheet of paper and just lay it out flat. And the idea is that by painting a texture onto that flat surface, we can have all those details projected back onto the original 3D model. and that effectively is how UV unwrapping works. So we're going to need to use Blender to create the UVs for this model and project it onto a flat plane. So how do we do that? Well, let's get started. We can come up here to the File menu and change the interface preset. I have it set here to modeling. I was using that for creating the models. But now that we've created the models, we want to start creating UVs. And to do that, we can move to the UV editing preset. I'm going to select that preset. And when I do so, we've got here on the right hand side the same user perspective 3D view that we have been using. And you can see the model here, and we can just rotate the view around and check out the model just as we could before. But we also have on the left hand side the image editor, which is the flat surface that we're going to be projecting our model onto. So how do we get started at doing this? Well, the first thing we have to do is move over here to the user perspective view, select our model and enter edit mode by pressing the tab key on the keyboard. And I want to switch to face mode here. So I'm going to right click and choose face mode and select all of these faces because I want to project them all onto the flat plane. And then I'm going to move over here to the mesh menu and choose mesh, UV unwrap, and then I'm going to select unwrap here, like so. And when I do that, straight away you can see we get something appear in the UV editor. And these are the UVs for the model here. Now right now they're not looking too good, and the reason for that is because we haven't got any cuts or imaginary splices in this model so that it can unwrap nicely. What Blender is trying to do is to keep the model and its proportions intact and just sort of fit them all together on a flat plane, and the result is that this wall section, you can see these faces here, they represent the long wall section here. It's kind of curved. Now we can see that distortion easily by using a UV grid, and this is going to really help us make sure that our UV mapping is proportioned correctly. Now the way we can use a UV grid is we move down here to the button that says New. We're going to be creating a new image. So I'm going to choose New, and I'm going to name this UV grid. We can call it anything we like, it doesn't have to be that name. And I want to create an image of 1024 by 1024. The size here is not too important, but just make sure, try and keep the size, the width and height equal. And I'm going to remove alpha. We don't need alpha transparency for this image. And in generated type, I'm going to select UV grid and select that there, and then choose OK. And when I do that, you can see that the UV editor is then filled with this grid pattern. And right now in the viewport we don't see this grid pattern at all, and that is because the shading mode is solid. You can move down here to the shading mode, and right now it's set to solid, but we want to change that to texture. And when we change it to texture, we can now see this checker pattern applied to this model. And already we can see the distortion that is occurring. Right now on the floor here, these checker patterns are appearing as a diagonal piece. But more importantly here, you can see on the walls that there are even bends and kinks inside these checker patterns. They're not applied correctly across this wall. They should appear just as they do here in the image editor. They should appear as squares and undistorted, but that's not how they appear. So to fix this, we're going to need to insert some seams into this model. And I'm going to show you how to do that next. In the preceding movie, we saw how to get started with the UV unwrapping for our meshes. But we saw also by using the UV grid that distortion is introduced into our model, and we can fix that by inserting seams or imaginary cuts or splices into the mesh. And so what I'm going to do now is really look at the different places in the mesh where we're going to insert those cuts. We don't want to insert them just anywhere. In fact, when working with Unity, we want to try and keep these cuts to a minimum. So let's see where we can insert them so that this mesh can unwrap nicely. So I'm going to press the tab key to go into edit mode. I'm going to switch to edge mode. And we need to select the edges where cuts are going to be made. And the first place that I can identify a potential cut, let's just switch to solid shading. The first place I can identify a cut is going to be here where the floor meets the wall. I'm going to have the floor as a separate piece. So to do that, I'm going to select this edge and then select this edge. And with both edges selected, I'm going to make a seam from them. Now to do that, we can do it in different ways. One way is we can choose Mesh, edges and then mark seam, or I can scroll down on this left-hand toolbox menu and I can choose mark seam here from the UV mapping category. So I'm going to choose mark seam, and when I do that you can see the edge now highlights red where it draws the seam. Now if you don't get this red highlighting, you can enable it by clicking on this plus menu here to bring out the object properties. You can scroll downwards, and under the display category here, actually under the mesh display category, you can see there is a tick here in seams, and you want to make sure that this is enabled. If it's not enabled, then those seams will not appear on your mesh. So I suggest enabling them for now. Let's just fold up this menu here. So we've identified one seam here. But we can also see that here, where this pillar meets the wall, there is a change in the direction of the surface. And the way this is all fitted together, this is going to be very difficult to unfold normally. So we're going to need to insert some more seams. And the way I'm going to handle this is really I'm going to have the front of this pillar here as one piece, and then the side as a separate piece, and then just have this wall as its own piece as well. So let's get started at doing this. So I'm going to come into here and let's just find maybe this edge, and I'm going to, whoops, not undo that, don't want to transform it, and I'm going to select this edge, and I'm going to scroll upwards, and maybe we're going to select perhaps this edge here. We're going to insert a cut there. I'm going to add a seam with this edge here, and let's just scroll out a bit and just have a look at what we're doing here. So I'm going to insert another seam there, and again a seam around the edge. Insert a seam here, also another seam I think here and here, like so, and another seam there. So again I'm going to choose mark seam, and you can see that we've drawn that red border around here to indicate that a new seam has been marked here. So that's looking pretty good. Where else can we insert a seam? Again here around this section of the wall is where we're going to be inserting another seam. So I'm going to select this edge, and this edge, and also this edge and this one, and then choose mark seam. So that should be enough edges now for us to start unwrapping this model successfully. So let's take a look. I'm going to switch back to the UV editor and enter edit mode and select all of the faces. Here we can see the previous UV mapping that doesn't work quite very well at all. So I'm going to choose mesh and UV unwrap and UV unwrap. And when I do this now, you'll see on the model we're getting some good looking UVs here. We've got no distortion, we've got everything looking just as we want it. They're all squares, and in fact when you have a look at the UVs on this map here, you can see everything is nicely aligned in rows and columns, and we've got no distortion. If I right click on the UV editor and I choose island, I can select the individual pieces, and you can see we've got the side wall piece, we've got the front of the pillar piece here. I think there might be a bit of distortion up here, but we can probably easily fix that. You can see it's because there's a certain cut here. Let's take a look at that cut. Let's have a look where that is occurring. So that's occurring here with this edge because it's not unfolding properly here. So let's select that edge, and I'm going to choose mark seam. So let's scroll down to the UV mapping, choose mark seam, and insert a new cut there. Now we've inserted that, this should look much better. So I'm going to unwrap this again by selecting face mode, choosing all of the faces, again choose mesh, UV unwrap, and unwrap again. And now you can see that issue is repaired. So now that's looking much better. And we have all of our UV islands, and they're looking pretty good. So next we're going to be having a look more at the details of the UV editor. In this video I want to discuss Blender's UV editor and some of the preferences and controls that I use when working with it. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to start by maximizing the UV editor, and in fact in Blender you can maximize any viewport with the keyboard shortcut Shift Spacebar. So I'm going to move over this with my mouse cursor and press Shift Spacebar, and that will maximize the UV editor. I can press Shift Spacebar again to restore it back to its original size, so it's a toggleable feature. So let's maximize the UV editor. I'll press Shift Spacebar and just really sort of maximize and have a look at all these UVs that we have here. Again, I can hold down the Alt key on the keyboard and use the middle mouse wheel to scroll the UV editor view here. So we're looking at these UVs, but one of the first things that I noticed with this checker background is that unless the faces are selected, it's really quite difficult to see these edges and faces and vertices. If I right click and choose Island mode, which allows me to select UV islands, that is a group of faces and edges that are all connected together and separated by the seams. So I'm going to select this island, and you can see this refers to all the walls of the mesh here. So that's one island. When it's selected, the shading makes this a bit darker so it's easier to see, but it's still not clear enough for my taste. So I'm going to change these settings from the User Preferences dialog. I can do that by choosing File and User Preferences, and make sure that you select the Themes tab up here and UV Image Editor over here. We're going to be concentrating on the settings Vertex Size, Face Selected and Face. The face shading controls the shading of faces that are not selected, and these ones of the faces that are selected. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to scroll this window over a little bit, and I'm going to change the vertex size from 3 to 5, and as I do that, the size of these vertices will increase in the viewport. So now they're a bit more prominent, and I like to work with around about that size. Then for the shading of the faces, the non-selected faces, I'm going to click on that here and change the alpha transparency of that shading. So right now it's 0.39, and I'm just going to increase that, and as I do, you can see in the viewport here that the shading of those faces just darkens up. I'm going to select it to about there so that I can see the faces more prominently, and yet I can still see the checkered pattern behind it. I'm going to do the same thing really over here for the selected faces. I'm going to darken up those shading as well, make it a bit darker so that it's a bit more prominent than the non-selected faces. And in fact, I'm going to come back to the standard faces and just really lighten up that shading just a little bit to create some difference between the selected and non-selected faces. So I'm going to work with something like this, and that should make the faces a bit easier to see in the recording window as well. So I'm going to close the User Preferences dialog, and the other thing that I want to discuss is about transformations. Now I'm going to right click and choose, for example, Vertex here, which will allow me to select specific vertices in the UVs. Now of course, as I start to move these UVs around, we're going to get transformations and distortions in the UV mapping of the mesh. But one thing I notice that when I select a vertex, for example this vertex here, now if I were working in the standard viewport, I would get a control gizmo appear with arrows in either direction that I could drag to move those vertices. But in the UV editor we don't get a control gizmo. We actually have to use the keyboard shortcuts. So to transform and move this vertex, I have to press the W key on the keyboard, and then I can start to transform that vertex around. And I click to confirm that change. If I don't like it, I can press Ctrl Z to undo it. And the same works for rotation and scaling. So rotation is E and scaling is R. So I'm going to press Shift Spacebar to exit the UV editor. And just so you can see what the effect of moving around the UVs does to this mesh, for example, this vertex here that I have selected is part of the floor. So as I press the W key and start to transform it, you can see a distortion starts to happen on that floor face. So I don't really want to make that sort of changed, so I'm going to press Escape just to completely exit the translation mode. So that really is how we work and control with the UV editor. That's going to be important over the next few videos as we're going to be working and controlling the UVs for models. So before we go ahead and create the final unwrapping for all of the environment pieces together, I want to just spend some time with this particular piece and insert some seams so that we can unwrap it successfully, and then off screen I will go ahead and insert the seams for all the remaining meshes You don't need to see me do it for each and every mesh because it's the same procedure. You have to insert the seams, identify the places where you want to put the cuts so that they can unwrap successfully. So if I press the Tab key on the keyboard to enter edit mode for this mesh, you can see that already I've inserted some seams in the places where I've inserted it before for the other mesh, the other wall mesh. So here I've got the seams for the pillar and the seams where the floor meets the wall. But this mesh, because it contains more detail, needs more seams. So for example, here on this wall area we have these extrusions, these boxes that protrude out of the wall. So I'm going to make sure I'm in edge mode and select these edges here around the perimeter and also these edges around the perimeter. And in my toolbox here I will scroll down to the UV mapping section and choose Mark Seam to create a seam for those pieces. I also am going to insert some seams here at the corner pieces so this can unwrap successfully. So again here, insert some seams for these 4 corner pieces. So another one here and there, and then choose Mark Seam. So we have some seams there for these pieces, and that's looking pretty good. So we also have the floor area here. So we're going to have quite a few seams here because I'm going to be mirroring the mapping and overlapping the UVs so that I can texture just one piece and all of the pieces will have that texture mapping. So we'll see how that works shortly. So what I'm going to do is select this edge and then hold down Control and Alt on the keyboard and select the second edge. And what that does is you can see now it has found the edge loop all the way around here and has selected all of those edges together. And then I'm going to choose Mark Seam. So now there's a seam here. And I'm going to repeat that procedure again for the bottom edge loop. So holding down Control and Alt to select that second edge loop and choose Mark Seam. I'm going to do the same for these 2 edge loops here. So I'm going to hold down Control and Alt to select the one around here, choose Mark Seam, and the same for the edge loop below and choose Mark Seam. So we've marked those seams there. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to insert some seams around here so that I can overlap these corner pieces together. So I'm going to select this edge here and this edge and this one. And I'm also going to select this one, and this one. I'm going to move over to the other side and basically do the same thing. So select that edge, and that one. And again, over here, I'm going to be selecting that edge, and that one. I'm going to choose Mark Seam so that we mark those edges there. And again, I'm going to move over to the other side and repeat that procedure. So select those edge loops, these ones here, that one there, and there. Move over to the other side and select this edge, and this edge, and this edge, and this one, and this one, and again choose Mark Seam to mark in those seams. I'm also going to add a seam over here in the middle so that I can reflect the UV mapping on both sides. So again, select this edge, and this edge like so, and choose Mark Seam. I could come across here, I guess, and also add a seam there if I wanted to. Right now I'm going to leave that out. So here I've gone ahead and just marked in all the critical seams that we need. So let's apply unwrapping to this. So I'm going to switch to face mode. Actually, I'm going to switch to the UV editing mode. Make sure I choose all faces in this mesh. Choose Mesh, UV Unwrap, and then Unwrap, and you can see that now all of our faces have been unwrapped. So we've got our separate UV islands that you can see here. Let's just switch to textured mode like so. I'm going to create a new UV grid here for this mapping. So just switch off alpha, turn on UV grid, choose OK. You can see that mapping on here now, and everything's looking pretty good, including the mapping on the floor here, the mapping on these protrusions. So that's all looking pretty good. Next, what I'm going to tackle is the process of unwrapping everything for our environment pieces. So now it's time to unwrap all of these pieces together. And off screen what I've done is I've assembled all the different pieces that I've modeled together on one layer, which is this layer here, and I have separated them apart on the grid. So I've used incremental snapping to just offset the different meshes onto different parts of the grid. They're snapped nicely to the grid sections here. And then I've just combined all of those separate meshes together using the join command that we have seen before, so that I've joined all the separate mesh pieces into one mesh. This is going to be important when we do our unwrapping, because we want to unwrap all of these pieces together and arrange their UVs inside a single texture space. So now let's try and unwrap all of these together. Now you'll see if I go into edit mode by pressing the tab key, you can see that I've inserted the seams for all the different pieces. So we have our floor piece here, another floor piece here, the crate props, wall sections, the inward corner, the outward corner over here, and some more straight sections. So what I'm going to do now is switch over to UV editing to bring up the UV editor. We can see we have our modular pieces over here. We're in the texture shading mode here, and right now everything is white because they don't have any UVs at all. We're going to change that now. So I'm going to enter edit mode and switch to the face mode and select all of the faces in this mesh, and then choose mesh, UV unwrap and UV unwrap. And what this does is it unwraps all of the UVs and squishes them all inside a single texture space that you can see here, and you can now see the grid pattern on all of the mesh pieces. And if I maximize the UV editor, you can see that what has happened is we have all of these UV shells, these islands, just packed into exactly the same texture space. And in fact, looking at it quite like this really makes it rather confusing. It's difficult to know which piece refers to which piece on the mesh. So we're going to try to make some sense of all these UVs before we go any further. So the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to try to isolate all the UVs on a per mesh basis. So for example, let's say I'm going to switch to face mode and select all of the faces for this mesh here. So now I've selected all of the faces for this straight section piece. And when I've done that, you can see over here in the UV editor, if I press Shift Spacebar to maximize that, you can see that it's now showing me all of the UVs that are associated with that mesh piece. And in fact, all the different pieces are sort of spread apart all over the UV space. Now I want to try to introduce some organization into these UVs. So what I'm going to do is right click and choose vertex mode, and I'm going to select all the different pieces, press W to translate these, and I'm going to start to bring them together in a kind of square space. So let's select this piece, press W to transform it, again select this piece, W to sort of transform that, and I'm going to transform that piece as well, and this piece, and this piece. Again, let's bring this piece over here, this piece over here, and now I can select all of them and just bring them outside here and just separate them so that they're all over here together. And what I've done now is I've isolated those UVs for this piece. If I now press Ctrl A to select all faces, you can see everything has their UVs in this UV space here, except for this piece, and its UVs are organized and arranged over here. I'm not planning to keep those pieces here, but I'm just separating them out so that we can get some organization into here. So now what I'm going to do is select a new piece, let's say for example this wall piece over here, and you can see it selects those UVs for this piece here. So let's start to again repeat that procedure, bring them into here in one sort of square, and this piece over here, bring that into here. Again, bring this piece into here. Just zoom in a bit, they're quite close together, some of these pieces. Bring this over here, and this one over here. And again, we've got another piece organized, and I'm just going to bring that off to the side as well. Press Shift Space to return back, And again, I'm going to repeat this procedure for every single piece, just separating their UVs out into isolation so I know which pieces are which. And I'll resume recording, or I will start the next video after I've completed that process. So I'm going to go ahead and complete that off screen. So off screen, I've gone ahead and isolated all the separate UV pieces for each of these different elements of the mesh, and you can see them all here in the UV editor. And the next stage of the process is really overlapping and consolidation. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me show you. For example, let's choose a piece. Let's just zoom in here and see what we can find. Let's take, for example, this mesh piece here. So this section of the mesh, you can see this here. We have this sort of wall section. Now let me just press Shift Spacebar so that I can turn off the transparency for this mesh and we can see it in a kind of solid display. So we have our wall mesh and these two interior elements here. Now let's press Shift Spacebar and go back to the UV editor. Those two recesses correspond, let's select Island, to this piece and this piece. You can see that these two pieces are these center elements, and when I move them you can see the UVs moving here in the viewport. Now both of these pieces are really kind of the same thing, and I don't want to have to paint two lots of texture data into each of these. So instead I can make these two pieces overlap so they share the same texture space. This really is a way of economizing on texture space. So let's have a look. I'm going to just maximize this viewport here. And again, we can begin to start transforming these. I can, for example, select the vertices and move them independently, but I'm going to stick with islands for now, and I'm going to be using snapping to overlap these two pieces. So, for example, let's take a look here. I'm going to activate the snapping tool and make sure I select vertex and choose closest. And just press W on the keyboard to start snapping this in place. And here, voila, these two pieces overlap exactly. So that's looking pretty good. Now, of course, we can also find some other areas where we can overlap them. For example, take this piece and this piece. I'm going to press Shift Spacebar. These two pieces here refer to the sides of the pillars that you can see here, and the other side is here. So this really is just the mirror image of this piece. So what I want to do is select this island here and choose UVs and choose mirror, and I want to mirror on the x-axis like this. And now again I can come in and use my snapping to overlap those two pieces. And again, this piece here is the front here, the pillar, and also the pillar on this side is represented by this one. So again I can do some snapping here, and now I've consolidated those pieces together and we have some overlapping between these elements. Now the overlapping doesn't have to stop here. What I've done here is just simply overlap two different elements within the same sort of mesh area. But I can extend outwards to the other meshes and overlap those pieces. And let me show you what I mean. I'm going to select all of the faces in here and Shift Spacebar to maximize this view. Take, for example, this piece that we've already selected for the side of the pillar. Well, in fact, I could go hunting around in these UVs and find, aha, we've got another pillar piece here, which is this one. And that represents the pillar section for the mesh over here. But we know that all of these pillar sections are pretty much exactly the same thing. So even between all of these separate pieces, we can overlap them together. So I'm going to select this piece and I'm just going to move it down into this section here. Select this piece, move it down into this section. Let's just turn off snapping. And again, I'm going to go hunting around. Let's see if we can find any more like that piece. I think that may be all of them. No, it isn't. No, it isn't. There are some more here. So I'm going to select these pieces and sort of transport them over to this side. And again, I can then start to reflect these pieces. So UVs, mirror, x-axis, UVs with this one, mirror, x-axis, turn on snapping again, and I can start snapping them all into position and overlap them all in this way. And in this way I can overlap every single common element. So off screen I'm going to start overlapping all of these pieces, And when I've done that, I'm going to assemble them back into this square to create a nice unique layout for all of our mesh pieces. So I'll resume recording in the next video when I've done that. So off screen I've consolidated and arranged all of the UVs into one single consistent texture space, overlapping all of the common elements so that I can really economize on that texture space and make sure that everything is optimized. So let's just take a look at how I've done this. Let's go over to the UV editor and I'll press Shift Spacebar on the keyboard and you can see all of these UVs arranged here. Now, one thing I want to point out is you'll notice that I've not really aligned the UVs to the very edges of the texture. I've allowed a certain margin of pixel space between the UVs and the edges of the texture, and that's generally good practice. That's going to help your textures look as good as possible. Also, I've allowed some spacing between the different UV islands, and that's also good practice. Don't try to align them right up against one another. That's really not a good idea. Leave at least some margin of space between them. Also notice that, again, arranging these UV islands, I've arranged them in a kind of row and column format. You'll see that horizontally from left to right here, these UVs represent the floor pieces of our environment. And again, along in this row, we have all of the lower walls for the environment, and here we have the upper walls. So that's going to make it really easy for me to kind of paint along in one line when I bring these into GIMP and paint our textures. So that said, here we have our UV layout, and what I want to do now is export this UV layout to a file, to an image file. And we're going to be using that file as a kind of reference when we start painting our texture. So I'm going to select all of these UVs here. I'm going to select face mode, press Ctrl A to select all of those UVs. And to export them to a file, I'm going to choose UVs and export UV layout. Select that from the menu. I'm going to give this a file name of just UV and layout, like so. And I'm going to scroll down so we can set the properties for this file. I'm going to make sure that PNG format is selected. And for the dimensions of the file, I'm going to set this to be 2048. Width and height, so 2048 again, and accept those changes. And I'm going to press Export UV Layout here, just to export that UV layout, and then it creates a file for us. I'm just going to bring in a Windows Explorer window that you can see here, and here we have the UV layout file. So I'm going to choose Preview, and you can see here we have the preview of this file. So there is our UV layout, and that's ready to import into an image editor. So things are looking pretty good.